Good morning and welcome, Sunflowers. This is Rosemary, and you are watching Good Journeys Tarot, 78 cards in 78 weeks. And this week, I thought I should probably start by telling you a little bit about what this is, since last week I had a unusual number of new people viewing, and they weren't sure what we were talking about. I started a project over a year ago now where I have been studying one card in the tarot each week and creating my own version of the card. And we are now halfway through. I look at the imagery from various decks in my collection, as well as read the guidebooks and various tarot books in my library to study the card. And this is something I feel like everyone should do at some point if they're studying the tarot, is to try and create their own deck. Whether it's out of, magazine clippings or stick figures, or as I'm doing Creative Commons imagery online, or if you're an artist and can draw it. This is a practice that has existed in esoteric communities for a long time. As they progress in degrees within their schools, they will create their own decks. But more so for me, it is really about the educational aspect. Yes, it will be great to have an end product, which I can work with. But the process of just learning things that I never would have learned about these cards if I'd not dug into them this way has been just great for me. So excited to see Hannah has already made it in. Glad to have you here. Um, so the last week, as always happens, the card of the week has just come up in my life, right? As soon as I drew the Tower card, I started having those apocalyptic, anxiety driven dreams again. And up until this morning's week ahead reading, I have just been a basket case. For me, many times the tower presents itself as anxiety. I haven't had this much anxiety since probably 2017, 2018, when I fully transitioned to female finally. And so it's been a crazy, crazy couple of weeks here working with the tower. And this morning, I had a really great reading, which looks like things are going to move away from this, but it has really influenced my activity the last week or so, not really knowing how to deal with all of that. I guess it was a good thing to study the tower and learn some new things about it, since I was going to be going through all of that anyway. Um, So today, as I said, we're talking about the tower, and you'll notice I have a picture here. It's not actually my coloring of the card. This is an image from the StarCon program guide, which accompanied a article by Beverly Frable in which she talks about other alternatives to the origin of the tower versus the traditional idea of the Tower of Babel from the book of the Bible. And I thought it was a beautiful image. What's interesting to me is this person is actually dressed like the fool from the TDM with his little harlequin pants and everything, rather than as a king. You'll also see the Hebrew letter over here. Peh, which is associated with a tower, meaning mouth. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I thought that was a beautiful image. I wanted to make sure I shared it with you guys today. So let's look at some of the cards that I drew for the tower. And I didn't really draw on all of the cards I have that are RWS specific, like clones, because they're pretty much a depiction of this same imagery, which we see time and again. And I'll come back to this and talk about this image when we look at my coloring of it in a while. But let's look at some of the cards from my deck. And I will tell you, I found more cards in my deck that I really wanted to show you. I mean, my collection to show you than for any other cards so far. I try to keep it to 10 to 15 cards because I don't want to spend the whole day showing you cards. but I ended up with almost 30 cards, and I had to go through and just get rid of some and say, okay, never mind. I have to narrow it in some way. And so I pulled cards that um, perhaps add a little bit of a new aspect or understanding to the tower. The first one is the Fyodor Pavlov Tarot. This was a Kickstarter deck, and it is being published by US Games. It's currently on pre order on their website if you're interested in the deck. Um, and what I like about this one is if you'll see the person falling from the tower has wings, hinting at that story of Icarus flying too close to the sun. The idea that the tower moment here is not just an act of God, but as a result of our own actions and behaviors as well. And so, but you see all of the traditional aspects: the flood, the lightning, the fire, the earthquake, all of the elements acting upon this worldly creation there. Some decks will focus on one of the catastrophes that happen in the traditional card. For example, the Minoan Tarot by Laura Perry encompasses the flood or tidal wave, which I think is very fitting for an island nation as it is. Beautiful depiction. The Modern Love, a much more modern day, relatable thing for many of us. You know, we know someone or have heard of someone whose home burned to the ground. Definitely a tower moment in people's lives, and so focusing there on that. For me, the lightning has always been an important part of this card. In fact, if I notate this card in my journals, I always use a lightning bolt to represent it. That's just what has always been the focal point for me. That's the symbol that pops out at me. In the Spirit Keepers Tarot, there's the addition of the volcano in the background, another type of destruction that we see. You also see the Typhon or the serpent, which appears throughout this deck, wrapping around the tower. A lot going on in this card. But I did love in the original version of this deck, and I believe in this one as well, the tower, which you see being destroyed here, appears in card 17, the star, where we see that healing and hope, that restorative energy coming into play, and it is now rebuilt. And so that's one of the things I really loved about the first two versions of this deck, which didn't make it into the last one. I rarely pull this deck out because it's kind of its own little system. It's the English Magic Tarot, but I did love this depiction of the Tower of London with the lightning and everything. But because of the crows in the front, I don't know, something about the addition of the crows helped make this more catastrophic for me. I've always loved crows. To me, I don't see them as a bad omen, though some people do. I think that's probably the intent here because a lot of people see this card as a bad omen, though we'll talk about how it's not necessarily. I think the most poignant cards that I found for the tower are the ones that depict animals in my decks. I don't have a lot of animal decks, but some of my decks do have imagery that includes animals. One of those is the 5 Cents Tarot. You'll see the turtles here stacked up, caught by surprise as the waters have receded, and just kind of hanging there on one another's backs. I thought that was an interesting idea. The lily white has probably the most dramatic depiction of any that I have seen. This poor elk or deer or caribou or whatever animal it is has lost its horns due to a lightning strike. It just seems painful and like an act of nature. And so I could not include this card. I do love this deck. It is gorgeous. In the Light Seers, it's a tree being struck, a squirrel losing their home. A depiction that actually appears in several decks of an animal losing their home this way, when a tree is struck. In the Bone Stone and Earth Flash, it's a completely different kind of take, and it is actually an eagle getting captured in a snare. And obviously, a trap being a sudden surprise for any animal. Um, and so it was a very interesting idea that she took there and ran with. In the Mystic Garbage, there is this candle burning, hinting at this idea that we're doing this to ourselves, right? We are. It's not just nature or God acting; it is actually because of what we're doing, what we've built up, and so she's actually kind of tripping over herself as she is burning brightly there. I only included the Goblin Tarot because I like the fact that it reiterates that idea of we're doing it to ourselves. He's built this tower and he's jumped on it to ride it, and immediately he chops off his own hair because of the way he's constructed his tower. And so it's not just that nature is acting or God is acting to tear down what we've built up from our shadow, which we'll talk about later, but that we're doing it to ourselves. I like the slow tarot, the card, Tower of Cards, our house of cards, so to speak, a phrase that is often used about when things fall apart. It's an interesting idea. One of my newer decks, this kind of from the Work Brain Santa Morte Tarot, the tower is kind of a maze. Like, you can't really tell what's going where. It's been kind of haphazardly constructed, if you ask me. And as a result, it's probably going to collapse. So the last two are the ones that kind of are the direction that I ran in with the tower. Because I don't know, it's just more relatable to me. In the way that the tower shows up for me in readings and acts and behaves for me in readings than this kind of cataclysmic catastrophe falling apart of everything. And that is this card from the Pocket of Peers. And the person depicted here is Lisa Robinson. And Lisa is a writer, and she talks in the Pocket of Peers guidebook. Each of the artists that are depicted by Jamie Sawyer got a little blurb about the card if they wanted it. And she talks about how, more often than not for her, it's about the revelation, the insight, that spark that is obtained from the universe, which leads to the next thing or the rebuilding of something in our life. And that's an idea that is picked up in some more other modern decks. Probably my favorite depiction of the Tower card is from the Hip Chick Tarot. If you've not seen this deck, I interviewed Maria Strom, the artist who created this, at her home in Athens, Georgia, at the very beginning of my YouTube journey. And we talked about this card and about how, as Rachel Pollack says, how we handle this card depends on how prepared we are for what occurs in card 15, the devil, or in the case of my deck, the shadow. If we are prepared, we can take that destruction and we can begin something new. We can take off, use it as a launching pad to start over fresh. And that's really what the star is about, which comes after the tower, is making the best out of that situation and moving forward to recreate your life. And so she depicted that here in her tower. I love this card, mainly because, again, both of these highlight that lightning. It's very clear and beautiful, which is the thing that has always stuck out to me about the Tower card. So let's talk about the original image. This is the coloring that I did this week. I didn't do the tower gray because I've run out of gray and I've got to buy a new gray pen. So I did that kind of sand color that I tend to do stones when I'm running out of the gray concrete color. Really, I just chose colors at random for their clothing. You'll see I did actually color part of the clothing red so that the people were kind of on fire. And I did the crown purple because it equates with loosely the crown chakra as well as Keter on the tree of life, something that we're going to look at in a minute. In this depiction, something that I really never thought about, I just always saw these as little flames sparking off the building, but they're actually yodes. And we've talked about the yodes before when we talked about the Ace of Swords and the swords representing divinity and the divine presence. In this case, the divine or nature destroying that which we built up materialistically that is inhibiting us perhaps from where we need to be spiritually, emotionally, in our personal development, and so that we can start that new journey, that new growth that we see in the star which follows this. And this is something that affects everyone, as they've noted here in the Smith Waite, by including the crown. The crown almost looks like a jester's cap, i.e. the fool falling from the tower as well. And that's something, as I mentioned before, that Rachel Pollack hints at in her book, 78 Degrees of Wisdom, that, when we are prepared, and I'm going to just read that here. If I can find the phrase, here it is. So obviously this is a dangerous process, right? That catastrophe, that lightning strike, that all of that energy coming in to devastate what we've built up. The unprepared person can become trapped in the illusions of the devil. And we will see the release of energy carries its own dangers as the psyche tries to integrate it with conscious awareness. The hero on the way back from the center of the labyrinth can become lost if he has not carefully prepared himself. And so this idea that the result of the tower, of this catastrophe, as it were, is dependent upon how we prepared ourselves up to then. If we are prepared, we're probably going to get much more this reaction than, say, we do this reaction, right? The end of the world, so to speak. And I like it when the cards come together like this, when we can look at groups of cards. So we have the shadow, that card where we're building up our worldly connections, that materialism, food, money, fame, glory, whatever it is. And then in the tower, that is all being taken from us, right? It's being destroyed and giving us that opportunity in the star to grow new. Since we're looking at books, I wanted to read the entry from the Hip Chick Tarot. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it is actually an all-female deck, and it interprets the cards, as you can see, a little bit more positively than some of the ones we traditionally see in a negative like say the Tower. But here's what she had to say about her tower from a spiritual perspective. You have so much energy waiting to be released. The Bound card, and that's the Devil card in her deck, reminded you about the restrictions your defenses and ego impose. And so this card is really about the destruction of ego. That's something that comes up again and again in all of my reading. Now, the Tower card shows up to set you free. That idea that the lightning is breaking down that which is holding you back. Even if it's something that you have enjoyed and you've worked hard to build up, it is the thing that's been holding you back. The card screams liberation. The lightning bolt represents insight that can come as a flash, destroying illusions and breaking up old ways of thinking and being. The old structure is crumbling and your true self is being released. This is the experience of profound, drastic spiritual transformation. Um, and so that's something that everybody hints at to a degree, but typically we don't see that in the cards, right? We usually just see the catastrophe that's being focused on. And this is really about breaking down the self, breaking down the ego, so to speak. This card is associated with Mars, which is our card of assertiveness, that card of a burst of power. And we really see that in the lightning, right? Um, and it's about making what we want a reality. And that's really the goal of this card. If we have prepared ourselves to deal with change, right? We're going to arise in the star, fresh and renewed and headed in the direction that we want to be. And I'm certainly hoping that that's going to be the case this week for me after the nightmares that I've been having. Um, in the Rosicrucian Arcanum, which I hint at times, that more Christian influence that we see in the tarot sometimes. Typically we hear about the Tower of Babel story from the Bible when we see the tower, right? About people trying to build a tower to God and then God destroying it and separating all their languages and that kind of thing. But the Rosicrucians talk about this tower as the tree of life. And I'm going to share a version of the tree of life here with you to kind of give you a picture in your head, at least, of what we're talking about. And so you'll see here on the tower in the picture, there we go. In this picture, there are 3 windows, and they say, okay, these 3 windows are those top 3 spheres on the tree of life. That point where we meet the divine, right? And we're separate, and the divine divides into that which is masculine and that which is feminine on the 2 sides of the tree. And what's happening here in the tower is the fall in the Garden of Eden. This is when the man and the woman have risen up against God, so to speak, and now God is separating them. He is creating a divide, hence the lightning coming down, striking through the tower. And then they have to go out again and they have to create that balance, that center column, spiritually rather than physically. And so some people will look at this card as a physical destruction, while others will understand it to be a spiritual destruction. And that really depends on the other cards that are around it in your tarot reading and the topic of your reading. Sometimes it can be about physical destruction, but more often than not, it's the destruction of ideas in our head, ideas like this tree of life, perhaps, that need to be reshaped and reformed in our mind and our understanding of the universe, as it were. We do get many times from this card chaos and adversity and shock. It could be about disgrace or ruin. To me, this is kind of that 10 of swords on steroids. I see a lot of the minor arcana reflected in the majors as I've studied through the cards. And typically this is a much more important idea that's being destroyed for us. It can be about sudden change, a loss of security. But there is that aspect of revelation, right? That's represented by that lightning bolt. It can be an epiphany, a wake-up call, inspiration even to move forward. And we see fire here. Fire is not just about destruction, but it's about purification. So the idea here is that we're being purified of those things that we have wrong or that are holding us back, so that we can proceed forward. We've talked about the yodes and their representation of the divine and the divine shaking up our life. there in the tree. And we've talked a little bit about the crown representing that ego that we need to get past to move forward. So there is an idea in the Terre de Marseille, which is liberation. It's much more about this type of feeling than the Smith Way. It's also about uncorking or revealing secrets. It's also associated with orgasm, which we see in a lot of erotic decks, some of which you'll see on my GJT After Dark channel, and that I've recently been talking about in my video there, as well as revelation and illumination. So you can see that, this meaning has adapted over time, right? From the TDM to what we see now in the Smith Way. And so we've gone from this idea of revelation, liberation, enlightenment, to destruction, chaos, and calamity, as it were, in the Smith Way. And I think there are versions of that on both that work, right? Because that without that catastrophe, without that destruction of the old ideas, we're not going to get to the new ones, the enlightenment, the revelations that we need in our lives. I had one more thought that I wanted to share before we started looking at the card that I created, and now I don't remember what it was. So sorry. Oh, I haven't really talked about the shadow sides of this card. So because this card typically for most people is very negative in the upright, what is it like when you see it in the shadow? Well, there are really three alternatives here. One is, depending on the reading, right? It could be that we're coming back, right? It's the comeback from that destruction, from that chaos, from the calamity, as it were. It could be that it's just a less intense change, right? It's not as bad as saying the end of the world. Or it could be about avoiding that disaster altogether. Those are just some possibilities. But still, there is this aspect of destruction that is going to exist. It's whether how intense it is or how well we deal with getting past it that we see kind of in the shadow side. So let's take a moment and let's look at the card that I created. Obviously, if you are in the Good Journeys into Tarot group, oops, sorry, trying to send the link to everyone. You will have seen this already this week, and we've been talking about it a little bit and sharing some imagery. And when I first started, oops, I actually was creating a very traditional image, an image of a lighthouse, because that's something I kind of sort of relate to because I lived near one for a couple of summers. But I didn't really like any of the waves that I was finding to work with, and it felt too Smith Waite to me. And then as I was doing my reading, particularly the Rachel Pollack book and studying the Hipchick Tarot as well, I began to get this idea that I should relate it to the devil in my deck or the shadow card. And this was the original devil card that I created with Tarot Stash's great idea for the pentacle out of the chains. And I thought, okay, so if this is the devil and the tower is the next moment in that story, right? The breaking down of what we see here, then perhaps it should represent that in some way. And so I use the same image, the only difference being I've added the lightning and I've resized some things. And initially, I just moved all of the various pieces of the pentagram out. So it looked like the person was bursting from this old idea into a new idea after this lightning strike, which has hit them on the crown, right? This revelation. And I wasn't sure about the blue. The blue seemed a little bright for me, but I didn't want to use the green that I used in the shadow. And I played with another color for a bit. And then I just went back to the blue for the time being and decided to play with other things. So, like, instead of having the chains just kind of fall in all directions as they were already, I had them more, I spread them out like a rays. So, like, you could tell they were bursting out, so to speak. Um, and then I had the idea that maybe the blue needed to be rearranged because even though the lightning looks really great against the darker color, when lightning strikes, that part of the sky tends to light up. And so I thought perhaps that would be the way to go. You'll see I also started changing the shades of the chains so they would reflect the light a little bit. I couldn't decide whether the chain should be in front or behind the lightning. I think I decided behind just because I want the lightning to really pop. Um, and Then I decided that perhaps that this should be changed. The name of the card from the tower to something else like lightning, because that's really the focus for me. Always has been the focus on that card, and there's not really a tower in this card, right? And that's actually what some cards um, are called in some decks. They call this card lightning versus um, the tower, right? They focus on that revelation that's coming down. And then I actually ended up thinking I knew the blue was too bright. I kind of mellowed out the blue in my card because I feel like this card needs to be a little bit more subdued. It needs to be a little bit darker or grayer, because this is a little bit about catastrophe. I mean, getting struck by lightning is not a pleasant experience from what I understand. And so I do want that aspect in the card as well. And so I've toyed with the idea of adding some other stuff to the card, like maybe some yods around or something. But right now, I think I'm pretty happy with this version of the card. Um, and One thing that I want to talk about, because I always put the little symbols on the bottom of them, and sometimes I forget to talk about them, is I had mentioned the Hebrew letter earlier, and the Hebrew letter is Peh. Peh meaning mouth. So this association with this being an act of God or the voice of God, destroying things, so that we can then build ourselves back up. And so, and that's, I think that that's an interesting concept. I'm actually studying those Hebrew letters right now in a study. And so I try when I look at the majors, think about how those letters relate to the cards um, for myself. So we are ready to move forward to our next card. Um, so I'm going to be drawing it. So for those of you who have not been here before, this is my first tarot deck. Well, the first working tarot deck. The first tarot deck I really didn't work with because it ended up being a pip deck. And I am using it just for this study now. You'll see I have actually written on it and whatnot to study. So, and we are over halfway done now. And by this time next year, I will be well into finishing up the guidebook, which I'm trying to work on along the way. And some weeks I do better than others. I think I've skipped 3 or 4 cards where I haven't written anything on the entry. Our card for this week is, interestingly enough, going to be Strength, another major arcana. This is a card that came up in my readings last night several times when I was on Mutus Liber, the Discord that Benabel Wynn started, doing some classes. And this is actually my moon sign on my astrological chart. So this is a card that I've thought about a bit, but this is not a card that I have any ideas as to what I might actually put on the card. So it will be interesting to see how that card turns out. This may end up being one of those cards where I follow this traditional imagery of the card more so than with some of the other images in the deck, but we'll see. So Hannah, this is the I think it's 1971, 1972 version, which is still in print. It comes in a blue box with this background on the box in kind of like a white or foil looking color. It's a square box, and it comes with a small version of the pictorial key by weight. A lot of people don't really like it. They think it's ugly. At the time, when I bought this in 2006, I think it was. I thought this was probably the best version that was available. Since then, there's been a lot more versions available, including many more inclusive interpretations of the Smith weight, and so I don't really use this on a regular basis anymore. It's more I keep for the sake of it. Was my first deck, and it has some damage, so I don't like working with damaged decks. And so I just started using it to study, writing things on it, and that type of thing. So we'll be talking about strength this week. If strength is a card that really appeals to you, perhaps Amy from Strength Reversed would like to come and talk about the reverse of strength for me next week. That might be fun. But if anybody would love to join me sharing some of their favorite strength cards and talking about the card, let me know this week so that we can come together and do that. And until next time, everyone, good journeys. Thank you for stopping in.